We're now going to create some flowers to add to the tree that we were just working on, and be able to mix that with the other cloner object. So I'm going to start by modeling a petal, and then duplicating that, creating instances and differences from there, and also creating modeling some of the other sections. What I'm going to start out with is a plane, and set my width and height to 3 to begin with, and just not going to pay too much attention to keeping it real-world scale at the moment. I will be able to resize it later. Now I am going to change what would need to be the width segments and the height. I'm going to switch around which is going to be which. So 4 height segments, because we're going to have a little bit of curl, a little bit of bending, and that's going to make it a little bit easier to do that. Now I have prepared a set of materials, or a set of image layers to be used as the material. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag this in. It's just a flower petal, along with a bunch of additional maps within it. So let's start just by adding in the petal, so we can go ahead and size it correctly. And now what I need to do is modify the material in order to bend and set up the bump and other additional layers. After that, we can then go ahead and change the geometry to conform a little bit better to the way the texture is set up. Also adjusting the object axis once we're finished. So double-click on the material. This is set up, and it's called just flower petal. You can load it in. I just used a drag and drop. May or may not have as many layers as I do, but the ones I'm going to be using will definitely be included. Since this is a layered material, all I need to do is copy the texture channel and turn on the channels I want. I'm going to hold off on the luminance just because it's going to destroy the OpenGL for the moment, and just turn on the bump, the normal, turn on the alpha, and go ahead and start with that. So now we can just paste on all of these different channels, and then we're going to be switching the layer set and selecting the different layers. So let's start with the alpha and select the alpha from the list, and then go over to the normal, and I'm going to try a couple of different ones that I've prepared. I'm going to start with just the main normal, which looks like it may be alright. Go over to the bump, and like I said, I'll go ahead and narrow this down to just the ones I end up using, because I do have quite a few to choose from in this layer set, and to keep file sizes down, it's going to be a little bit easier just to go ahead and only include what's going to be used. For diffusion, we can go ahead and select diffuse layer, which we also want to affect the luminance, changing the diffusion mix mode to add, and then turning down the primary layer. So the brightness around 40, and then add at 100%. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the luminance channel, and what we're going to do is set up a little bit of backlight, just something very simple. So we can go ahead and paste in the texture again, and set this up to be a fusion. I'm going to go ahead and copy my base channel over to my blend channel, change the base channel over to backlight, and now we can set the mode to, let's go ahead and start with a soft light, and then back in the main luminance, turning the brightness to 0, setting the mix mode to add, setting it to around 50%, and then going back into this and now adjusting which layer we want to use. If we want to use the main color, I have also set up a couple of other options. I do have a loom channel. The only problem is, because of the way the color is set up, this may not work very well with that backlight. So what I think I'm going to go ahead and do is go back into Photoshop, which is where I created the material, and just grab that luminance layer, create a copy, go all the way up to the color, which I'm also going to create a copy of, and modify just kind of the brightness of the color below. What I can also do is invert the color, and then just Control-I on the keyboard, and then Control-U to pull up the hue and saturation, and just move the hue all the way to the left. Sometimes you can cut it a little bit short, but basically we're creating an opposite hue to match more of the original color. And now we can go ahead and set up a blend in order to affect based on the color for the loom. So I'm going to go ahead and move the duplicate color on top of the loom copy, and go ahead and set this to overlay, and then we're going to modify the luminance channel, or the luminance loom copy layer, and Control-L on the keyboard to adjust the levels. And just going to pull the hint of color out along the veins, which I'm then going to blend with the existing color. So I'm going to create a duplicate of the other duplicate, and then I can select both of these just holding down Control and clicking on both layers, and then Control-E to merge them together. So now we've got those two, and we can add our new layer on top of it. We don't want to set that to overlay anymore. We can go through and see if anything looks appealing. But I think what I'm going to do is move this duplicate underneath the modified channel that we created with the blend, and just use a soft light and adjust the opacity around 50%. Just kind of lighten it up along the veins a little bit more. And then we can go ahead and first I'm going to just create a duplicate just to be sure that I save it, just in case this doesn't turn out to be the way I want it, and just merge those together. So Control-E. So now I'm going to create one more copy of the main color, and then set this to an overlay for the modified channel, and reduce the opacity. So we're just pulling out the brightness within the veins, but really adding a lot more to it. We could also switch over to pin light, which is really going to pull out that vein coloration. Some of those colors in there we don't really want within the final. So what I can do is adjust the hue, try to get something a little bit better, adjust saturation, but ultimately I'll probably put another copy of the main color once again, bringing it over on the top, and then we can set up a different blend. So we'll go ahead and use hard light, and that will help us lighten up those sections. So this will make a pretty neat looking backlight. Go ahead and holding down Shift, starting on the top, click down lower, we can go ahead and merge those together. And then we can choose to go back to the other one if we want to blend or mix it a little bit more. But now I'm going to go to Image Adjustments and Replace Color, which will allow me to use the eyedropper tool to select which area of color I'd like to replace, which is really more of the blues. You could also go into a selective color and just modify the blues. I do like to use Replace Color because it's a very direct selection. which can be helpful, although sometimes it can cause some strange problems or strange results depending on the colors you're working with and the overall contrast. So not always the best way to do this, but it is definitely a pretty good option. So we can adjust the fuzziness, which will change our total range, and just kind of move it to get to closer to the original color. Go ahead and lighten that up. Add a little more saturation to it. And just kind of adjust the fuzziness option until we get what it is we're looking for. And that should be good right there. So now we can call this color backlight. And I'm going to keep this alternate color and just in case we end up needing it, and just put the original color back on the top layer. You might need to do some adjustments, make a few adjustments, depending on the layer order and layer names within the main material. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and then what I can do is go back into Cinema, and it does look like things got changed around just a little. So we go in here and reload the image if it hasn't reloaded, and then we can select from Layer Set. So we are in the Luminance channel back in there. We go to the color backlight we just created. And then we might need to modify the main color to put that back. And just double check and make sure that everything else is set correctly. It does look like that's going to be okay. So overall, this doesn't look too bad so far. Go to our Luminance channel, and if we need to make any adjustments, maybe set that to a hard light for the mix. It's also a good idea to add in a light. Go underneath the object and just take a look and see how that's reacting. And now I do have it set up so the diffusion channel is affecting the luminance, which means the veins might not be glowing as much as I want. So I'm going to turn off the effect luminance and see if we can get a little bit more out of that. I think that looks a little bit better. The OpenGL for the top is really overexposed, but that's because it's not calculating the luminance backlight properly in this case. In other words, it's running the backlight on the top, just giving us an overall luminance on the top, which is not going to show up in the render. If we go into the Fusion for the luminance, we can also set the mode, the blend mode, to color, to be just a direct impact on the backlight color. What also works pretty well is using the overlay. You can go say lighter value. Multiply might darken it up too much, but then we can have kind of an in-between with the slider. Hard light's a very good overall solution for leaves and flowers. But I'm going to go over to the color, and we're going to give that a try, because that looks pretty nice overall. It's also taking into account some bits of the normal. So now what we want to do is modify the rest of the flower and be able to create additional petals. just modifying the luminance a little bit here, make it a little more interesting. So I do have it set to affect the luminance. I'm just making a few changes. Overall, it doesn't look too bad. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the material palette and just rename this flower petal. Flower petal 1. And make sure I go ahead and save this. So I'm going to select the object and the plane, rename it Petal. I'm also going to create a copy of it right now just to kind of have a backup. So copy and paste, Control-C plus Control-V. And go ahead and hide the original. This way what we can do is hit C on the keyboard to make it editable, modify it, and then if we need to go back, we can. And that way we can avoid setting it up and creating additional setups. It makes it a little bit easier to have sometimes come back and have a backup, considering it's just really a very small object, doesn't really take up a lot of the scene. So now I'm going to go over to the points and turn off the only select visible elements with the rectangular selection tool, and just come in here and start to bend down the petal. Kind of pull that back, making sure we're not stretching the map too much, getting kind of an overall bend on the flower. And then from the sides, what we can do is dip those down. Really depending on the type of flower you're working with and how you want the petals to bend, you can modify this a lot of different ways. Now I'm going to take these center 2 points and drag them down a little, which means I might need to just pull some of those side points up. We don't want to create anything too distinctive because we are going to be modifying it or cloning it, so we wouldn't want a lot of flowers looking or having very noticeable characteristics that can be found. I think I'm going to go ahead and just slice this down the center using the knife tool. So switch polygons, K on the keyboard for knife, switch the plane, and we're going to go ahead and use the YZ and turn off restricted selection. And just go right down the center, just clicking once, go back to the points, and now selecting with the live selection tool, just the main selection, we can modify this a little further. Keeping in mind that as we modify the points, it is going to modify the stretching of the way the flower is mapped with the UV. So if we make too large of changes, it will stretch out the object a bit. So we just need to be careful not to stretch it out too much. So just going around and having very subtle changes really helps the normal map kind of calculate everything and light it correctly. So now we can go around the edges, and I think what I'm going to end up doing is just lifting those up, just so we can dip in the center a little easier. So just going around the edges, pulling those up to make it kind of fold into itself a little. You can also pull in some of these points. We just want to accent the curvature and make a few modifications to that center. And maybe pull that down. So I think that's going to be a pretty good start. If we need to take this section here in the middle, we can go ahead, rotate that, maybe bring that in a little. to kind of cup it a little bit more. It will look a little bit better that way. Select some of these side points. And I think the normal map is a little too intense, so I might need to reduce the intensity from 100, maybe down to 50. So we're going to go over to the material editor under the normal and turn the intensity down to about 50 and see how that's going to look. I might end up switching to a different normal. And it looks like possibly the backlight, or it could also be the Phong angle is kind of subtracting from this. So I think I do need to go back to the diffusion and unfortunately remove the effect luminance in order to get that to lighten up a little bit more. But we'll see and make little modifications to that once we get more towards the final scene. So I'm going to switch over to the object axis and change this so it's by kind of the base part of the petal. And we're going to be using kind of a cloner. We also need to set up what it's going to be connected to. I'm going to go to the MoGraph pull down and add in the cloner object. Set this object to the radio, at least for now. Change the radius to a very small amount and just drag the petal into the cloner. So now I need to adjust the up axis. So we're going to do the XZ. And right now we have a lot of overlapping. We do have 5 total petals showing up. And I don't want as much overlapping as showing, so what we can do is start to increase the radius a little. And I might need to go into the object and scale it down just a little width-wise. What we can also do is go into into the point edit and just making sure that we're in the right area. Selecting these points on the bottom and then stretching those and pulling them in, which is going to create a little bit of curvature in the center. We can also grab that next line. If you need to, you can pull it out of the cloner object so you can see it a little bit better. Looks a lot different now. So we're just going to kind of pull these points in and just make it work a lot better for a 5-petal type of flower. And basically just kind of changing the stem area. And then if we need to on the end, go ahead and grab this side, these 2 points, and holding down Shift, doing the other ones as well. And then we can switch over to the scale tool and just kind of move those in. If we have to, we can also just pull that whole side in. And if you need to change the shape, maybe if you want it a little more heart-shaped, you can modify some of the other points. These corner points, too, can be very useful, but more specifically for editing the normal, because they are going to be non-planar polygons if we modify them too much. Pretty much all of them are going to end up non-planar, but that should be okay. So we can go back, add this to our cloner, and take a look at our flower. And we might need to adjust just kind of the curvature a little bit. But it is starting to get a little closer to my original intent. Might need to modify the normal if the lighting isn't correct. But so far, it looks like it should be okay. So now what I'm going to do is create a base for the flower. Also add a little bit of randomness to the petals and the way they are going to kind of bob up and down or adjust the pitch. We don't want to do it with every single one, although one easy way to just adjust out all of them is by going to the transform. And then if you also want to make modifications to the curvature, which you can do by modifying the Y scale, we'll kind of cup it out a little bit more and stretch it, make these nice little modifications. And all of these can be animated too, and this is probably one of the best ways to animate these different types of flowers or these types of objects within the cloners using the transform tab, just because it is definitely the most compatible. Just add a little bit of bank, so it's -5. That'll help with some of the overlapping on the sides. I'm also going to go over to the cloner and make sure that I turn on the render instances. Make sure that fixed clone is on. Otherwise, what's going to happen is it's going to kind of send it off in different directions, which sometimes might be what you want. In this case, we do not want that. So now what I want to do is add a little variation, and probably one of the easiest things to do is just add an effector. If we're going to have any sort of wind on the petals to make them move individually, then the best thing to do is set up the random effector for that. But we still want to have a little bit of motion that's different from that. So we can use the step effector, shader effector, a lot of different things we can do. I can also set up just a double effector having two different randoms, one for just modifying the pitch and the main rotation. So go to our cloner object, and under the effector tab, drag in that random effector, and then back in the effector, we're going to make sure rotation is turned on, and we're going to modify pitch. Just to get to a point where it looks okay, we've got a nice variation. If needed, you can go to the effector tab, turn on indexed in order to get a slightly better result. We can also synchronize that motion. That helps for these minimal types of changes in order to add just a tiny bit of adjustment. So we've got just a little bit of change in the pitch there. And it looks like I'm stretching out the texture map a little bit, maybe too much. So I might just kind of modify it, going to the transform tab and stretching out maybe the Y a little bit, adjust that Z scale. See how that looks. And overall, I don't think that looks all that bad. So now we got to focus on creating the base. We can also create some center details. It really depends on the output that you want to have. This is turning into a little more higher res of an object, just because we might not really even see them all that closely. So you need to pay attention, or really just kind of keep in mind how many you're going to have in the scene in order to really design things to fit correctly. I'm going to go back into that random effector and also set up a little bit of a scale change. Since it's such a relative, I am going to use a subtractive value, so we'll go ahead and do -0.2. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off synchronized, because that was creating things a little too equally. Synchronized does have another main property or use. Maybe we'll get around to that a little bit later. Okay, so now we can call this flower. And this is really just temporary. I could end up changing this from the radial mode over to the object mode just to fix it to the next section we're going to be modeling. So I'm going to change my display to current shading. Actually, it looks like there might be a problem with the alpha. So what I'm going to do is go over to the material, and under alpha, turn off soft, because it was set to soft, and then we need to invert it. We do not want to have a soft alpha on these edges, otherwise for animation it's going to cause just numerous problems, and mainly flickering. I am going to go ahead and change the lighting model. So in the material editor, go to the illumination tab, and we're going to go ahead and change the model type. So now we have a roughness setting, and I'm going to set that to 100, which is going to disperse the light a lot better. I'm also going to increase the diffuse level to 120, and the fall off to 15. So we should be able to get a slightly better lighting. Keep in mind, too, it's a good idea to render to the picture viewer, as well as using the editor, the rendering to the viewport. But the quality of the outputted render is always better in the picture viewer, and can sometimes change. So I'm actually going to increase the diffuse level to 135, make it a little bit brighter, because we do kind of want the flowers to glow a bit, and that should help out. We don't have shadows enabled at the moment, so really we don't want to do too many modifications. So let's go ahead and model that bottom section. And right now we have 5 petals. So if I'm going to end up using an object mode for the cloner object, we would want to have a good number of polygons, or positioned correctly, really, to be able to attach each of these. So there's a couple of different ways we'd be able to create this bottom piece, really depending on the detail we're going to end up needing. I think I am going to go back into the petal and take the center section and just some of these points in the middle and pull them forward. So kind of dropping that down, and then selecting the 2 on the sides, just using the size tool to modify those. And then if you really feel you need maybe more polygons to make it look the detail that you need, once again, depending on how closely you're going to even see this in the scene, then you can always go back to that backup object and work from there. Okay, so now we've got a little more curvature towards the center. We are starting to manipulate the texture quite a bit, so I might need to scale this down. To match a little bit better. Add a little more bank. And now we'll start working on the bottom.